The Supreme Court recently denied a stay that would have protected a state's Second Amendment sanctuary law. This law bars state agents from enforcing federal laws, which in fact violate the Second Amendment. And now, the Eighth Circuit has heard this case on whether or not the law is valid or not. So let's talk about what just happened. Now, real quick before we jump into the video, I want to let you guys know that the new episode of the Liberty Lounge podcast is now available. I will leave a link to it down below in the details section in the pinned comment. It's a podcast we are releasing every single week. Myself, Jared from Guns and Gadgets, and then also Johnny B. So if you guys want to listen to it and support that content, you can find a link down below to where you can follow on YouTube. And then also make sure you're following on all the audio formats, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Thank you guys so much for all of your support. And let us know in the comment section what you guys would like to hear of some of the episodes going forward. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about an 8-1 order that was issued by the United States Supreme Court and how it has impacted a state's Second Amendment sanctuary law. The recent Supreme Court order, that 8-1 order, denied a stay which would have protected Missouri's Second Amendment Preservation Act. But this last Friday, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel, heard oral arguments in this case and will rule whether or not this case is valid or not. In 2021, Missouri passed a law which is the Second Amendment Preservation Act, and that's what's being disputed in this case. The law sets the state of Missouri's interpretation of the Second Amendment and sets restrictions on the support and funding to enforce inconsistent federal laws. This law in Missouri prohibits Missouri officers, agents, law enforcement, government officials, and really everybody in the state of Missouri, anyone tied to the state, from helping federal agents who are attempting to enforce and put in place inconsistent federal laws. This statute uses the 10th Amendment as a basis to refuse state resources, funding, and assistance that would be used then by federal agents to infringe on the Second Amendment. This statute also created a civil remedy where anyone, any citizen, and any resident of the state of Missouri could sue Missouri's officials, law enforcement officers, etc., if they help to enforce a federal law that does in fact violate the Second Amendment. Now, in response to this statute, the Second Amendment Preservation Act, the United States government has sued Missouri. In this case, the U.S. government sued Missouri under the theory that the law is inconsistent, that it's unconstitutional, because the statute is premised on an incorrect interpretation of the Second Amendment. Essentially, the U.S. government argues that Missouri's super pro-Second Amendment law, the language that they included in the statute, primarily in the summary section, is unconstitutional, and the government's more limited interpretation of the Second Amendment is correct instead, and therefore the entire statute should be deemed invalid. Now, this Missouri law is similar in nature to what Texas has with SB 8 and the abortion law that recently went up to Supreme Court, and there was a decision on that issue in the Whole Women's Health case. That fact is also very important for why the Whole Women's Health case and that decision was referenced by Justice Alito in the recent 8-1 order in the United States Supreme Court in this Missouri case. If you aren't aware, the Texas abortion law, or SB 8, prohibits an abortion if a fetal heartbeat is present. That law is different from some other laws because it's not enforced by the state of Texas or any of its law enforcement officers or any of its executives, but rather it allows individuals to sue any other individual who performs or knowingly aids and abets in that conduct. SB 8 shielded Texas and its officials from lawsuits since the statute allows only individuals to bring a lawsuit. The enforcement mechanism of that law was designed in order to make it harder, if not impossible, or at least frustrate the process of getting the entire law struck down. This is because courts don't actually strike down entire statutes or laws. What they do is place injunctions or enjoin the enforcement of a certain law. So for example, a court could enjoin Missouri and their attorney general from enforcing this statute in question, and the result of that injunction is essentially a nullification of the law. If the state is barred from enforcing a law, well, then the law has no effect. With the Texas and Missouri laws and their structure, however, you can't just get this umbrella injunction against the state and the attorney general since they're not actually the ones enforcing that language. Instead, you would have to get an injunction against every single individual, every resident who decides to bring a lawsuit. The Supreme Court found that since Texas in this SB 8 law is not enforced by the state or its agents, well then you could not seek this umbrella injunction against the state. You also couldn't even get an injunction against the judges and those clerks who are maybe trying to put in place or enforce the law because really they're not enforcing it, they're just kind of going through the process. Instead, you would have to get an injunction against each and every private resident who brought a lawsuit. So that's kind of the backdrop of the Texas SB 8 lawsuit, and then now also Missouri in the Preservation Act that is now being disputed in what is now developed in this case. Now, the District Court on review struck down the entire Missouri law and enjoined the state of Missouri and its officers and agents from enforcing it. But again, that's the issue. The state doesn't actually have any enforcement powers under the statute. The people actually have the power. Missouri then appealed that decision up to the 8th Circuit and also asked for a stay of the decision while the appeal is taking place. However, the 8th Circuit denied the stay. That then led Missouri to file an emergency application up to the United States Supreme Court, and they wanted the Supreme Court to grant a stay. But ultimately, the Supreme Court denied the stay in an 8-1 order. The order of the Supreme Court stated that the application for stay presented to Justice Kavanaugh and by him referred to the court is denied. Justice Thomas would grant the application for stay. And then there was a statement from Justice Gorsuch and then Justice Alito. And the statement states that, with the understanding that the District Court prohibited only implementation and enforcement of HB 85 by the state of Missouri and its officers, agents, and employees, and any others in active concert with such individuals, I agree with the denial of the application for a stay under the present circumstances. An injunction purporting to bind private parties, not before the District Court or the challenge provisions themselves, however, would be inconsistent with the equitable powers of federal courts. And there they are citing the whole women's health case. So Justice Thomas was the only one who would have granted that stay. And ultimately, because of that 8-1 order and that denial by the Supreme Court, then the case went back in the hands of the 8th Circuit. The 8th Circuit decided to hear expedited arguments and expedited review in this case, which actually happened this last Friday. During the arguments, Missouri's representative first argued that this entire lawsuit brought by the United States government is in fact invalid because the lawsuit does not name a proper defendant. Really what they're hitting at here is that this is an improper lawsuit, maybe that there's also no standing. In this case, the government is suing the state of Missouri and its attorney general, but the statute only allows private individuals to actually enforce the laws. Therefore, there is no proper defendant in this case. That's at least the argument. They also go on to state during the arguments that the U.S. government cannot identify a single act that the state of Missouri or its officials have actually engaged in that has harmed the U.S. government. Instead, the main point that they're putting forward of the injury that they have is that what is in place right now in this statute with HB 85, it essentially bars or prevents in some way state officials, law enforcement from cooperating with the U.S. government. And they're claiming that lack of cooperation and maybe funding is what's causing them injury. Now, what's interesting also about this argument is that the relief that's being sought is not really focused on curing any claimed injury to the federal government itself. Instead, what they are seeking is for the lower courts or the 8th Circuit to really grant some sort of relief that protects state officials, not the federal government. Missouri, in their arguments, also put forward that under the Prince v. United States case, states like Missouri have the authority to withhold funding and tell their people, their law enforcement officers, to not enforce certain unconstitutional laws. And that's exactly what they are arguing and putting forward here in this statute. Now, during the arguments, the U.S. government also put forward some main points for why they believe that what they're doing is proper and why the 8th Circuit should rule in their favor. First, they put forward that the statute does have enforcement components to the point where the state is still involved in the enforcement of the statute. The U.S. government conceded that under Prince and the 10th Amendment, a state can withhold funding and withhold certain support, but they claim they can get around that fact because the law is in fact more operative in nature. So here they're saying it's not as detached as only citizens enforcing the statute. They're claiming that the government, maybe the attorney general and some law enforcement, are still having some sort of enforcement. And there they also point to a lot of language talking about it's the duty of certain law enforcement to make sure it's implemented. So they're trying to say that it's not as detached as the statute actually claims to be. Now, finally, in the rebuttal section of the arguments, the state of Missouri and the representative argues that the federal government is more upset with the whole rhetoric in the statute, talking about that the federal government has violated the Second Amendment. So they're arguing this isn't necessarily an issue about how the statute itself operates, removing support and funding, which is proper under the 10th Amendment, but they're more upset about some of the rhetoric in the statute. So these arguments were really interesting. If you guys have some time, click that link, listen to them. But in general, I have a feeling that out of these arguments, the judges probably will still side with the federal government, maybe in a 2-1 decision. I think maybe at best case scenario, maybe there's some standing findings. I think that's a best case scenario for our side. Maybe they find there's a lack of standing, or maybe injury wasn't shown by the federal government, or maybe some things need to be modified and be sent back down to the lower court. but I think this will be a 2-to-1 decision in favor of the federal government just because some of the questioning was a little bit iffy. So we will be looking forward to seeing what the decision of this case will be. And I think this question ultimately will find its way back up to the Supreme Court. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and comment down below and I will try to answer the best of my ability. Also, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of two-way news. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And don't forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.